All right, hello and welcome to today's webinar, our My Path to Preservation with preservation architect Andrew Wolfram. My name is Lisa Versace and I am the Programs and Engagement Manager here at the California Preservation Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization providing statewide leadership, advocacy, and education to ensure the protection of California's diverse cultural heritage and its historic places. Our work is supported by the incredibly generous support of our members, donors, and sponsors who make free programs such as this possible. And special thanks are due to our annual education sponsor, Wish Janney Elsner Associates, as well as today's program sponsor, Groundwork Preservation. We are joined today by guest speaker Andrew Wolfram, preservation architect and consulting principal at TEF Design, who is joining us all the way from Italy. Andrew will be further introduced by today's moderator, Gretchen Hilliard-Boyce. Gretchen is a historian and a preservation planner with over 20 years of experience working in the public and private sectors. In addition to being the founder of Groundwork Preservation, a cultural resources consulting practice, Gretchen is a member of CPF's Board of Trustees and our Vice President of Programs. If you have any questions for Andrew during today's program, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And Gretchen, I will hand it over to you to get today's program started.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. I'm very, very happy today to get to introduce you to Andrew Wolfram. Andrew is widely recognized as a voice in the regeneration of existing buildings and the adaptive reuse of complex historic sites, particularly among San Francisco's waterfront, where he's done many projects. With more than 35 years of experience, he brings a rare combination of innovative design thinking and a strong commitment to both preservation and environmental and social sustainability. Andrew's leadership includes serving as past president of the San Francisco Historic Preservation Commission and as a design review board member for BCDC, roles that reflect his dedication to advancing the cultural value of historic places and their importance in creating vibrant, resilient communities. So without further ado, Andrew, I'll let you take off with your presentation and then we'll do a Q&A after.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Gretchen and Lisa, for that kind introduction. So I'm going to share my screen because I just have about a short presentation that I wanted to share. So let me just start with that and talk a little bit about my path to preservation, as we call it. So I developed this little time frame a little while ago, just kind of thinking about like, how did I get to where I am professionally? What has my path been? And I started out, I went to Columbia College in New York, and then I graduated from Columbia Architecture School with a Master's of Architecture. And one thing that I did that was really important in the development of my career is I got a Kinney Traveling Fellowship when I graduated. And so I worked first for an architecture firm for about 6 months. And then I spent about 5 months in India researching temples from the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. So that was a pretty formative time in my career. And then I worked for several firms in New York, but the one that I stayed at the longest was a firm called Buttrick, White and Burness that did a lot of work in New York focused on private schools. And when you have private schools in New York, typically you have historic buildings. And that's one of the places where I really started working on projects that were a combination of new construction and historic buildings. But I think my real interest in preservation actually was launched by my involvement in DocoMomo, which is the documentation conservation of the modern movement. I've always been very interested in that period of architecture. And the United States chapter of DocoMomo was just forming. I was one of the founders of that chapter and really focused at that time. There were a lot of threats to modern buildings because the idea of preserving modern buildings was a completely kind of unknown concept. It wasn't really thought that these buildings or of the recent past really needed to be preserved. And so that involvement in DocoMomo really sparked my interest in historic preservation and how these types of buildings really contribute to our cities, to kind of placemaking generally. I then moved to San Francisco, where I continued to be involved in DocoMomo. In fact, that's how I met Gretchen originally when I was the president of the Northern California chapter, and then she became the president, and we worked very closely together for quite a few years. In San Francisco, I joined a firm called SMWM, which later merged with Perkins and Will, and I was the project architect on the Ferry Building. I'm going to show you some of these projects actually that are highlighted here. And working on preservation projects, especially at SMWM and then Perkins and Will, I was then eventually appointed by the mayor to the San Francisco Historic Preservation Commission. And then I became president, and I served on that commission for 10 years. So this also sort of shows some of the projects that I worked on. Eventually, I left Perkins and Will and joined TEF, and I'm still there now, and just showing some of the projects at TEF that I worked on also that were both new construction and historic projects. So the Ferry Building was really the largest and one of the most important projects of my career. And I'm sure many of you know the history of the building. This important transportation center in San Francisco survived the 1906 earthquake. But when we took on the project, the building looked like this. It was just really a kind of complete mess. Most of the interior had been converted into offices. So there was a lot of work to do to restore it, both the exterior restoration, but probably one of the most important things was the recovering of this incredible space inside, the nave space. You can see it here when it was a transportation terminal, and then what it looked like when we took over the project. So it had been filled in with another floor. This was also a historic tax credit project, but it was quite controversial with the state and National Park Service because we were making significant changes to the architecture of the building in that we were creating openings to open up the ground floor of the building, which had never been really a public space, to this incredible nave space. And here you can see some of what the work looked like. In fact, the building, there were large sections where the historic fabric had been removed already. So it was a major reconstruction project to actually reconstruct these sides of the building to really restore that historic space. And then I'm actually still working. The building was completed, the renovation was completed in 2002, 2003. And I've been working on the building ever since. We did these infill nave shops, little kiosks, and then we're continuing to do improvements, helping the owners with their signage standards, different kinds of standards, working on different tenant improvement projects within the building. So the next project I want to talk about is what was the Public Health Service hospital in the Presidio. It was a whole campus on the very sort of southwest corner of the Presidio that had been built in the 1930s and then altered in the 1950s with these large wings, which were actually kind of from a modern architecture standpoint, were kind of interesting structures. This was a historic tax credit project as well. And originally, the idea was that we were going to do some substantial kind of rework to these wings as part of the project. But then the National Park Service determination was that we either had to demolish them or keep them exactly as they were. Which did not work, was not something the developer was interested in. So in the end, we ended up demolishing the wings and really taking the building back to its 1930s appearance. So this building was really interesting because it was a hospital. So it definitely had a kind of very institutional medical quality, and we were making it apartments, places where people would live. So how do you balance that sense of keeping the historic character, that character of a hospital, but also making it a place where people would feel at home and comfortable? There was a lot of work in the landscape as well. That was a really important component. And then we did do an addition, a 3-story addition on the back wing here that was connected with this new glass bridge because the original bridge was so deteriorated that the SHPO and the Park Service allowed us to take this part away and introduce some transparency into the building. A lot of the work was really interesting restoration work, removal of graffiti, really trying to keep that historic character, but also give it a sense of renewal. Gives you some sense of what the building looks like now. And one of the things that was very interesting in this building as well was just the planning of the apartments. It has kind of an unusual shape, kind of a shape like an anchor, because it was a marine hospital. And we had, I think, 36 different unit types in the building. So there was a lot of work trying to create interesting places to live. You get these really long, narrow apartments with lots and lots of light, which we thought was a really great feature. So the next project is a very important skyscraper in San Francisco. It's the Timothy Pfluger's 140 New Montgomery Street, originally the Pacific Telephone Building. And this building is a really beautiful Art Deco masterpiece, but was in really poor condition when we took it over, and it needed a seismic upgrade as well as all new systems and a real things like bike rooms, all new mechanical, electrical, and also more public space for the tenant usage. In addition, we added restaurants at the ground floor, so we made these entrance ways so that there was a way that the sense of entry was signaled for the restaurants, and then a whole new exterior lighting scheme. So a lot of the work was rehabilitation of the terracotta. We actually did do window replacement starting above the 3rd floor. So the windows were in very, very poor condition. These were steel sash windows, which had rusted out around the frame. So they were actually a dangerous condition, but we managed to keep the lower windows, the ones that you see as you're along the street. And then this was the rear courtyard, which had just was a place where there was just a large generator. So we turned this into a kind of public garden, public courtyard. And then the lobby had been altered quite a bit. So a lot of the historic character was still there, but was sort of muted, like they had replaced a lot of the elevator fronts. They had terrible lighting here. So this was a really, really wonderful restoration of this incredible space. And then actually the mail slot is now, you open this little door, and that's a interpretive display about the history of the building. So we still kept this here. It's no longer a mail slot, but it's still something that people use. And then the final project I want to talk about is the Presidio Officers Club, probably the oldest extant building in San Francisco, built in the 1770s, the original part as a part of the adobe fort of the Presidio. So you can see here, this shows the vintage of the building. So this part here was the original kind of adobe, part of the adobe Presidio. This part had been added in the sort of Victorian era, and then the building kept expanding, and then eventually there was this large modern addition that was built in the 1970s with some alterations up to 2000, and a lot of this stuff was built in the 50s and 60s. So the building had kind of lost, to a certain extent, its sense of, it was very difficult to understand it because it had been just, they kept adding and adding and adding it. So part of this was to really clarify the building, to give you some sense of the different time periods of the building, and to provide some open space so that you could see parts of the building that had been so obscured. And so we removed these, in the purple here, all these non-historic additions, and then we created a series of courtyards so that you could really get a better reading of the building. And it also separated that very large looming 1970s wing, so it wasn't quite so dominant anymore. So here you can see the building kind of being deconstructed a little bit. We spent a lot of time working on the restoration of the adobe structure because that needed to be seismically upgraded. And we had to do a lot of work related to the moisture, keeping moisture out of the walls. And then this is a view of looking at that street frontage with the new landscape. One of the courtyard that separates that 1970s building that has an Andy Goldsworthy sculpture in it. And this is the side courtyard that now has a restaurant on it. So it was kind of a mixed use building. And then a lot of the space was devoted to interpretive displays and galleries. So this is one of the original Adobe sections. This is what it had looked like before. We did a lot of 3D imaging to really understand the layers of history that were behind the building in this space. And then we're sort of showing the time frame of the building in the way this space has been kind of taken apart a little bit. So you really get a sense of the history of that space. And then this is the restaurant and then the Mesa room. And then you can see the new exhibit space. So I think that concludes my presentation section. And Gretchen, back to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. I love how, because you're an architect, you framed your whole presentation by your key projects, which I think is just really interesting. And it seems like each of those projects you worked on for a really long time too, like decade or more. Is that common? Like as an architect, do you often have this long-term relationship with a project and a client?
Yes, I would say when you get into historic preservation and when you get into projects that are larger or more complex, the timeframes can be very long.
Hmm.
So just to give you for an example, I mentioned the Kresge College at the University of Santa Cruz. We are working on that project with Studio Gang, and we won the project in 2016, and it's only under construction. The part that we worked on, which is the original kind of core part of the campus, is only under construction right now. Will be finished in 2 years. So.
Hmm. Yeah. I want to back up a little bit and ask you a couple of things about just like your career as it's evolved. So, what is it like to be a preservation architect like day to day? And maybe not right now, because now you're in Italy and you have this like different lifestyle, but like what's the like when you still lived in San Francisco, what did that look like? And then I also want to hear what it looks like now.
Mhm.
It's like what's it like
I
to be
would
an architect in this field?
in this field, you spend a lot of time meeting with your clients. Definitely a lot of time developing kind of concepts to sort of determine what can work and what can't work. The thing about a lot of these buildings, and that is often common in preservation, is often the buildings have been not used for a long, might be abandoned, or maybe they're in really bad condition. So you're trying to come up with a viable concept that works for something that feels like it's just kind of like, oh, this is like a wreck, like it's a mess. So you're spending a lot of time sort of saying like, what's viable? Like what will work? How can we create something the client will afford? And then when you have a good idea, you spend a lot of time trying to convince your clients that it's a good idea. So in fact, one of the skills that's really important is being able to present big picture ideas in a way that's kind of simple and straightforward and not get too much into the nitty gritty right at first.
Mm-hmm. Like, so, like you're a salesperson as well, trying to convince them
You
that your
are.
idea should move forward.
Yeah. Well, and also often a lot of clients, if they're not, I mean, a lot of clients, and this is true for both institutional and developer clients, like the historic preservation, sometimes they have to be convinced that it's a good idea. They might be like, oh, it's so expensive. Like, do we really need that? Do we really need those old finishes? It would be easier just to like do new stuff.
Hmm.
So often they need to be convinced that preservation in itself is a good idea.
Hmm.
And that there's a compelling vision like that when it's done, it's going to be beautiful and wonderful, and people are going to want to go in there and go see it and experience it. So
Yeah.
that's a really big part of it is just convincing your clients that the preservation is in itself a value. Like we as preservationists can see it, but often people, when they're confronted with the budget or time, they're like, oh, well, we could just do something cheaper that's easier.
Hmm. And at what point did they come to you as the preservation architect? Is that after they've already decided to do preservation, or is it because they're forced to, or like what, like how do you get involved then if they're not necessarily on board with that?
Well, it depends. I mean, sometimes they might be on board that they're going to renovate their building, let's say. But the way that they want to renovate it might not be in a way that we as preservation architects, maybe it wouldn't meet the standards, or it wouldn't be like a renovation that really is in keeping with the historic character of the building.
Hmm.
So often we get brought on board in the feasibility phase most often.
Yeah. So while they're
And they're
still
trying to
figuring
think.
out what to do. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go to an audience question here. One person asked, what was your biggest challenge or regrets during your tenure on the San Francisco Historic Preservation Commission?
I would say my biggest regret, and this is a complex that still exists, and Gretchen knows it well, it was that we were not able to protect Park Merced, which is an incredible site in San
Uh,
Francisco, a landscape designed by the amazing and modern landscape architect Thomas Church. And we spent a lot of time trying to preserve it. And it's still extant, so it hasn't been demolished, but it's only because they haven't financially figured out how to make the project work. But
yeah.
the plan is that it will be completely demolished.
Yeah. And I think that one was hard for people to wrap their brains around. Like, if you just look at it and you don't look at it carefully, you might be like, oh, this is kind of ugly or whatever. But then if you go into the space, like into the courtyards, it's this pretty magical place, but most people don't ever experience it. And it was hard to convince people to save it. And yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think that was probably, I mean, it's my regret that it didn't happen. I mean, I think we did as much as we could to try to save it and to bring awareness of it forward. But
yeah. And in that case, the HPC saw it because there was an EIR. So they saw it as like a
right.
review and comment on the environmental impact report, but they wouldn't have seen it otherwise because it's not a city landmark and it wasn't locally designated, which is normally the purview of the Historic Preservation Commission. So that was another complexity of it. It wasn't previously designated. Yeah.
That's right.
Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. I haven't thought about that in a while. Uh, there's a question here about 140 New Montgomery, wondering what the building facade terracotta vendor, like who worked on that and any stories from that project.
Yeah, and now I'm blanking on the terracotta was by Gladys McBean originally. And Gladys McBean was actually involved, the company still exists, so they were involved in the restoration and making some of the new molds. So that was, I mean, it was terracotta is a beautiful material, but it is also sometimes not the most practical material in that when it fails, it like really, fails in a way that's very damaging to the steel that's supporting it. So a lot of it was really about making sure that the terracotta was well attached to the facade and to repair, not to do so much aesthetic repairs, but repairs that were just to keep any further deterioration from happening.
Mm. Okay, I'm going to the chat now for a question. Juan's asking, you focus a lot on materiality, which I understand. I come from an architecture background as well. But do you have any project that also attaches those intangible aspects of culture into the preservation work?
Intangible assets. I think I I would say the projects that I have related to that, I mean, the Ferry Building in some way has that, but because of its sort of history as a transportation center, as a place that was so important for San Francisco. Um, but I haven't really worked on ones that are focused so much on intangible assets. They're really just kind of more
Hmm.
material projects.
Because that's your expertise.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. If people wouldn't mind putting their questions in the Q&A, it's easier for me to see them, but I can see the chat too. So I'm going to move back to the Q&A box. Lynette, hi Lynette, asking what has been your favorite project to work on and why?
That's a hard question because I've actually kind of loved all my projects that I've worked on. I think have all been interesting. I think one of my favorite projects to work on is a project that has not happened yet, but it was the Hearst Gymnasium at UC Berkeley, which is a Julia Morgan and Bernard Maybeck building. And we were hired to do initially just a seismic assessment and as a feasibility study, and then we did this whole vision study for like what the building could really be, how it could again be the center sort of for education and recreation and wellness and its importance to women on the campus. So that was a project that I spent a long time working on and just had such a profound love for that building and its site. And it's unfortunately in very poor condition now. Right now, it's seismically very poor, so it's really an unfortunate that the university has not found the money to do that renovation.
Hmm. Is it just vacant or is they actually still in use?
No, no, it's still in use.
Ah, it's not
Yeah,
great.
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it
Okay.
has beautiful, beautiful marble swimming pools, marble lined swimming pools. Like if you
Oh
think you
wow.
need to go to Hearst Castle to swim in a marble lined pool, you don't. You can go to the Hearst Gymnasium because they're outdoor, beautiful outdoor pools. The two front pools tend not to be used that much. There's two front pools and then there's a larger back pool.
Oh wow.
Um, yeah.
Neat. Ooh, maybe a future CPF tour or something. That would be cool to
Oh
see it.
yeah, definitely a great tour. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay,
Yeah, it's
Ted.
also it was just to go on. I mean, it's similar
Yeah.
like to way the Ferry Building, like they just kept jamming stuff. So it had all this open space on the main floor, and then they've just jammed like offices and programs, all kinds of stuff in it. So the open character of the building is lost right now. So that's one of the things we were trying to restore.
I think it's interesting that a lot of the projects you showed that was the case where they were either removing
Yeah,
wings or insensitive additions or junk that they had put in the interior. Like that,
yeah,
that's amazing that I mean, I think it's hard to get people to agree to take things away.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But it seems like especially for the tax credit projects, that was a critical part of being able to even qualify for those.
No, actually, not really, because a tax
Yeah.
credit project doesn't require that you take anything away or take away non-historic features if they're
Hmm.
there. It requires that the work you do is in keeping with the historic character of the building, but you don't necessarily have to remove something that's, let's say, a
Oh, I
non-historic
thought I
feature.
thought on the public health service hospital you said that the maybe it was the
They
SHIPA.
did. No, the Park Service determined there that we either had to remove those, we couldn't renovate those wings because they were on the primary facade and they wouldn't be allowed now. That was kind of an unusual
Hmm.
condition,
Okay.
but we could have kept them the way they were.
Got it. If you didn't touch it, it would have been fine.
If we didn't touch it, it would have
Yeah.
been fine. Yeah, so it's
Okay.
kind of a funny
That's
determination.
interesting. Yeah. There's a couple questions about tax credits I might jump to.
Yeah.
Mitchell is asking if you find that the incentive of tax credits helps convince clients to go the extra mile regarding preservation.
It can. It certainly can. I mean, at 140 New Montgomery, we looked at tax credits, but the that's an office building with very narrow floor plates, and in order to get tax credits, we would have had to keep all of the corridors on every floor.
Mm.
And the developer just determined that that was not, they weren't going to be able to get tenants to lease office space that had this central corridor on a very narrow floor plate building. So sometimes the tax credit cannot be enough of an incentive. In that one, they were able to get the 10% tax credit because it wasn't listed on the National Register yet. There's a funny thing about the 10% historic tax credit, which you can get for a building that's not listed on the National Register.
Hmm.
But often, certainly a project like the Presidio Landmark, the Public Health Service Hospital, wouldn't have happened without the tax credits. And the Ferry Building probably wouldn't have happened without the tax credits.
Hmm. Great. Okay, I'm skipping around here. So Ted is giving you lots of kudos for all the great work you've done in San Francisco, um, and asking, are you optimistic about the city continuing to honor the preservation ethic, whose way you've shown? Like, how plugged in are you to what's going on in San Francisco right now? This is
Yeah,
one of the
I'm pretty
questions.
plugged in.
Yeah.
I think I'm generally optimistic. I mean, I feel like preservation kind of goes in these little waves, and sometimes we're like, oh, like people really care and they really want to save stuff, and then it's like, oh, actually, people don't care that much. But or there's like less interest or something else, newer takes over. I still am optimistic, though. I think San Francisco definitely has a historic, there's an ethos of preservation, of how important preservation is. It's possible that we'll lose maybe secondary buildings, more likely to lose secondary buildings than we would have maybe 5 or 10 years ago. But then if I think back to what it was like, 20 years ago, we've made big leaps, especially with like the modern movement. Like 20 years ago, you would have been hard pressed to really push for the preservation of a modern building.
Yeah, I feel like now it's pretty well understood that those are significant. But when
Yeah.
we were all working for Domokamomo, it was a bit of an uphill battle, even not that long ago, 10 years ago, even.
Yeah. Yeah. And if
Yeah.
I think about like the San Francisco Art Institute is now being renovated. And I think there was a point like at some point where there was some real concern like that Pafford Keating clay parts could be demolished. And I think nobody's thinking that they would be demolished now.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Another question. What is something unique to historical architecture that you may not see in other architectural typologies?
Um, I would say I mean, it really depends on the period, the architectural period in terms of the typology. I mean, one thing that can be unique is just the sort of sense of detail and craft. I mean, if you think about some of these buildings, there is an attention to creating just in like those, I showed you those elevator fronts at 140 New Montgomery, and that sense of the craftsmanship and the patterning of the way the metal, the ironwork was done, just that sense of like we're going to have something and we're going to just create a beautiful sense of texture and pattern. So often that sense of kind of texture is a little bit is I mean, for the most part, and if you look at new buildings today, they just don't have that same sense of texture that buildings of that period would have had.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, have you ever done work on a homestead house, a house and related buildings built by a family that made a claim under the Homestead Act?
I have not. No,
No?
that is not.
It's an interesting question from Anne.
Yeah,
Um, okay.
I'd love to. It sounds interesting, but
I
I
know
have
it
not.
sounds fun. I've worked on a homestead in Joshua Tree National Park
Yeah.
as a historian, though, not as an architect.
Mhm.
Um, okay. Jean is asking what company you worked with on replacing the steel sash windows at New Montgomery. Were the windows steel or another material? Or sorry,
Way
were
that
the
it,
new windows steel or another material?
the new windows were aluminum, but the profiles do match the original windows. And right now, I can't remember which company we worked with on that.
Hmm. I thought that was an interesting solution to allow a replacement of the upper levels,
Yeah,
and that's kind of a
yeah,
creative way to deal with that because windows, oftentimes it's very expensive to do
yeah,
custom, windows that match the historic. So that's a cool
yeah,
idea.
yeah.
Okay. A fun side question on what is that fabulous background behind you on your Zoom?
This is Portuguese tile work.
Nice. Just a photo. It's like right,
Yeah,
like a
it's a
photo.
photo.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Cool. Okay. Do you know any law firms or companies that help with tax credit syndication for projects under $5 million?
I do not know that. I know that Equity Community Builders does a lot of tax credit work in terms of helping the tax credit process, but I don't know of specific law firms that, especially I mean, law firms like Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher do a lot of work on larger tax credit projects, but for ones under 5 million, I don't know.
Hmm. Okay. Um, okay, here's a question from Allison. I come from a completely different sector and am interested in historic preservation architecture as a career change. Can you speak to gender dynamics for female architects in the past and present?
I think that historic preservation has a lot of um, gender diversity in terms of the professional firms. And if you look at firms like Architectural Resources Group, their leadership is almost all women. So I think it's actually a field that is more advanced than the architecture field in terms of gender diversity. Um, so I think that I don't feel, my sense is that there isn't, it's a little more advanced than architecture is, I would say.
Okay. Have you been involved with preservation of mid-century residential buildings?
I've been involved only as an advocate, so I haven't worked on any mid-century buildings from a preservation standpoint, but I have certainly advocated and worked with homeowners on the preservation of their buildings and advocating to have them be preserved.
Okay. All right, this question you'll probably understand. 10% LITC deeds sound pretty interesting and complex. Care to expound briefly?
Oh,
That the
this is
tax
the
credit?
10%, the 10% tax credit. Yeah, and I have to say, I'm an expert on the tax credit process in terms of state parks and National Park Service approval process, but I'm not an expert on the financial aspects of the tax credit process. But the 10% tax credit project is one that has a lower bar in terms of meeting the Secretary of Standards. So it has to sort of meet the overall intent of the Secretary of Standards, but it doesn't have to for all the aspects of the projects.
Hmm.
Um, so it's more akin to like when you complete the project that it would still be considered a historic resource, like that what you're doing isn't going to mean the building would no longer be a historic resource, but all aspects of your project don't necessarily have to meet the standards, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are there grants available for restoration of historic commercial buildings that are privately owned? Certainly tax credits.
There are certainly tax credits. Yeah, I think CPF is a really good resource for that.
Hmm. Okay. Um, okay. A question from Allison. Can you recommend any schools or programs that would allow a student to continue working full time while getting the degree? Also interested in hearing about Masters in Historic Preservation, more for project management versus historic preservation architecture route.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on, I would say, on schools these days in terms of, I mean, I know of the programs at all different universities, and certainly Columbia has a great preservation program, and UPenn has a great program. Um, but in terms of ones that would allow you to work and take the program, I'm not sure. And Gretchen, do you know? Do you have
I
a sense
know
of
that
that?
I know that Goucher College has like an online historic preservation master's degree
Right.
program that I think is more geared towards like continuing education while people are working. But most of the kind of traditional master's programs you'd have to, I mean, it's pretty demanding. Like I don't know. When I was at Penn, I did work a lot. Like I did
Yeah.
multiple internships that the school facilitated like I worked on restoration projects in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. So like I definitely was working, but it was more of like an internship type of opportunity, which was great. I learned a lot as well and got
Yeah.
paid.
Yeah.
But in terms of
What was the
working
second
full
part?
time,
Yeah.
oh, also just interested to hear what you think about the difference between getting like a master's in historic preservation versus a master's in historical architecture or architecture specific.
Yeah, I mean, a master's in historic preservation is a much more technical degree than like a master's, like a architectural history master's. I mean, a master's in historic preservation is a very technical degree. A master's in architecture is going to give you a really good design background and a good technical background, but it won't focus at all on the renovation or preservation of historic buildings.
And
I mean, it might
did you
be,
study straight architecture and then
I used
you
to,
developed your career into preservation in terms
that's
of the
right,
projects?
right.
Yeah. And that's,
Yeah,
I think,
yeah,
pretty typical.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, certainly if you do an architecture degree, you spend a lot of time learning about architecture history, but the studio projects you do are typically new, where you're like designing a library on a, you know, a city block or something. But I mean,
Hmm.
sometimes there might be some aspect of a historic building in it, but it certainly is not the focus typically.
Hmm. Yeah, and also I think like places like, we've talked about Columbia and Penn, but like University of Oregon, schools that have both architecture and historic preservation programs, there is that potential crossover where
That's right.
students can
Right.
take classes in the different programs and or sometimes even at Penn we have like collaborative studios. So it may be if this person is looking for that kind of both, it might be worth looking at schools that offer both programs. And then you can kind of,
Right. And often you can do a joint degree as well.
yeah. Yeah, usually it takes a little longer, but still.
Yeah.
And just elaborated that the homestead house they're trying to save is in Laguna Beach. So that's
Oh,
exciting.
wow.
Yeah. Um, I have a question for you, and I encourage people to put more questions in for Andrew. Can you tell us a little bit about, I think it's so interesting that you're in Italy now, and I know you're still working on a lot of projects in the
Mhm.
US, but like, what is the difference between preservation in the United States and preservation in Italy or Europe at large? Like, I have thoughts, but you live there, so I want to hear what you think
Yeah, I
about it.
do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I would say in some ways, I mean, here preservation, um, there's sometimes more looseness to the work that you can do. Like you could do a more modern, let's say if you're doing an addition or an interior in a historic building, there might be a sense of like, oh, that something really is modern and different. Um, but on the other hand, I mean, it's very constrained here as well. So, like if they're working in a historic context, the work that you do often has a real lightness. It's almost like you can't quite tell like that they've done anything. Like it's sort of the new stuff almost can also disappear, like because it's so subtle and it's so sort of light. Um, but often you'll see things you're like, wow, that wouldn't have happened in the States because they like done something like totally modern and interesting as well.
Yeah. Do you find though that like, I mean, I've traveled in Europe, I haven't lived there, but it's like,
Yeah.
it seems like people, it's just more part of the culture, like the historic aspects of the environment. Like people, it's
Yes.
like there's hundreds of years of history and thousands of years of history, and people, it seems a little bit more part of the culture. Whereas here, I feel like preservation is seen as this like extra thing that you might do. I don't know that. Do you agree with that or no?
I do. I agree with that. And also, there's a much more acceptance here of stuff might be like old and not quite work right, or
Hmm.
like people don't. I mean, you don't have like big garages, and people don't have like big. Everything is on a much smaller scale, and you're more likely to put up with stuff that like maybe doesn't quite work that well. For example, the
Hmm.
apartment building I live here in Milan, we have it's a six-story building. It has just one central staircase, which in the States it would probably not be meet fire code. And in the middle of the stair, there's an old elevator that has one of those metal cages on every floor. There's the little doors that you have to open, and like if you don't close the doors, the elevator won't, function. Like it's like all old and funky and it still kind of works and people accept it. So there isn't a sense like that everything has to be kind of new and big and fancy. There's a
Hmm.
much more acceptance of like things are kind of like a little like there's the spaces are tighter, they're kind of don't work well, and that's okay. This is like the way it's been.
Hmm. Yeah, makes sense.
You know.
Are you working on any preservation projects in Italy?
I'm not working specifically. Well, I'm volunteer with an organization, and we're looking for a new headquarters. It's the LGBTQ plus organization in Milan,
Hmm.
and I'm on the committee looking for new headquarters. And so some of the spaces we spent a long time actually working on this one building that was part of an old slaughterhouse. And so we did conceptual plans for that, and that one didn't work out. So we're now looking for a new site. So in some ways, I guess that's my one outlet of historic preservation is that work, the volunteer
It's
work.
probable you'll find an existing building, right? Like,
It's very like we will definitely find an existing building.
yeah, that's great.
Mm.
Okay, Elizabeth has a question. She says, I'm older and for a career change. I'm interested in working on residential homes that might be abandoned or derelict and restoring them to their original glory. I'm in the Santa Cruz area. Do you know anyone she could reach out to learn more about this area. It sounds like it isn't what you're focused on, but wondering if people you've met, or if anyone in the chat knows of anyone in Santa Cruz area too, like feel free to jump in. Do you know of
Yeah,
anyone?
and then well, I mean, I've been working in Santa Cruz for over 10 years, so mostly the people I know are like contractors and people with the university.
Hmm.
So I would reach out potentially to contractors in that area because there's a lot of residential contractors, small contractors who do really good work. There's a lot of really interesting work in Santa Cruz, historic work.
Hmm. Great. Um, okay. Let me look back at my questions. I'm like, oh, what else do I want to ask you? I guess one thing I always like to ask people to do is like, what kind of advice would you give to someone that maybe is looking to either get into this field or switch careers into this field? How do you get those entry points?
Yeah, my advice, and I think the thing in my career that I feel most gratitude for is to get involved in advocacy organizations, in community organizations, to be on boards. I mean, that's a really good way to meet people. It's a really good way to have your sense, sort of a sense of the pulse of what's happening in the field. It's a good way to give back. It's a good way to learn more. So that would be, for me, like Docomomo was key. I mean, I met so many people through Docomomo. And being involved in Docomomo, then I started meeting people in city planning. I started meeting developers. So it was a really, really good way to get involved. And it was something I was really interested in. So figure out like what you're really interested in and then get involved in that in some way. Don't just look at it like, oh, I need to get a job. I just have to find the right company. Find the thing that you care about and then get involved and start doing something with it. So that would be kind of my advice.
Mm-hmm. That's good
And
advice.
that's one of the reasons, I mean, I started working with CPF first as a volunteer on like the education committee, planning conferences, eventually becoming a trustee, but it was a lot of the work at CPF as well, was where I
Hmm.
met a lot of the people in the preservation world.
Hmm. That's my same experience too. I think I volunteered for CPF for like 15 years before I joined the board. It was fun. It was like helping
Yeah,
out
I
with the
know.
conference or helping plan
Yeah.
programs or whatever it was. Um, Another question I have that's kind of a little bit tangential is just like, what other practices, not architecture, do you have in your life that
Mm.
like you think contributes to your professional skills or even just your well-being? Like I know you do a lot of other things besides just architecture. Do you want
Yeah.
to talk about
For
any of
me,
that?
one practice, sure. One thing that I've found really fun and really helpful is I do improv. So the whole idea of improv is this concept of yes and you work with a partner with other people, and then you really focus on listening. So your partner says something and your response instead of is, I mean, often our response is like no or no but or whatever. Our reflex response is to say no to things. And in improv, you work on saying yes to things and then you add something to it. So you're really saying yes and this. So, that's a great idea and we're going to add this. And I found that can be really helpful when you're working, especially in teams. Like almost all work that we do in architecture preservation, you're not doing it by yourself. You're doing it in a team. And when you're working with other people, the whole idea of yes and means you really have to listen to what the other person is saying. Because so often somebody else is talking and we're already thinking like, oh, I'm going to say blah, 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 this other thing. But if you're doing this yes and, it's like you have to listen to what they say before you can add on to it. So listening is a really key skill. So the improv has really helped, I think, in my work on teams, working with people generally.
Hmm, that's fun.
Yeah,
It
and
sounds
it's
just
fun,
fun
and you
also.
meet
Yeah.
people, right? It's
Uh,
fun. The games are fun. It's like, you're sort of playing games for adults, so it's just it's a fun thing anyway.
I love that. Um, I'm like, what's my yes and? I'm trying not to think about what question I'm asking you next while you're
I know.
talking.
That's right, Gretchen. Now you just have to build off the improv concept, and you can say, "What I do is this other thing."
What about like how do you stay inspired? Like, what do you, I mean, gosh, you're in Italy, so I'm sure you're seeing all
Yeah.
kinds of interesting visual things, but like, what inspires you for your design work that you're doing?
I mean, I would say travel is definitely always been a really big inspiration. Being able to just see things, see what other people are doing, experience. When I lived in San Francisco and in Berkeley, I spent a lot of time walking, just walking around neighborhoods, just really being out and seeing what was happening. And so you just get inspired by just having your eyes wide open and being able to see things.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's very inspiring to live here because there's just so much to see. Just endless cornucopia of delights.
Yes. Um, what do you, so I remember years ago when I worked for Peyton Turnbull, Jay Turnbull said to me, "It's great you're involved in Docomomo. That's going to be like the next 50 years of preservation." I'll never forget that. He was like, mid-century
Mhm.
modern, that is like a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious, now that you've been in the field for 35 some years, do you have any insight on what is like the next phase of, like, what is the next thing we're going to be working towards? Or, is it postmodern buildings? Is it really that, or is it something completely different?
I mean, postmodern is definitely part of it, whether it's hard to know how much focus of the preservation there really will be of that period. And the unfortunate thing about so many postmodern buildings is they're just built so poorly.
Hmm.
So modern buildings were tended to be built in an experimental fashion. So that was the danger there. It's like they were trying to do these, let's have the concrete roof be as thin as possible and have as much glass as possible and have it be as open as possible. So it was this idea that we're going to use these experimental materials to show these ideas. And then for preservation, it makes big challenges because
Hmm.
how do you, when you've got these things or systems that are failing, how do you preserve them?
Hmm.
With postmodernism, because a lot of them were built as a kind of, they were sort of almost like a little bit of a pastiche or a cartoon of what a historic building might look like, but they weren't built in a using the same sort of robustness of historic buildings.
Hmm.
So then the preservation becomes a little bit more challenging.
Hmm. I also feel like postmodern is still really decisive. Like people either love it or they hate it. I feel like modernism has had
Yeah.
its day and people kind of generally seem to like it, but um,
Yeah, but I would say modernism is still, it is pretty divisive. Certainly brutalism. If you look at brutalism, there's a lot of people that are not on the brutalism train.
yeah, yeah, that's kind
Yeah,
of
I mean, the
again
Dallas,
that
there's a
later.
really interesting, IMP's Dallas City Hall is a really, really interesting building. It's got these big, it's by IMP and it's got these huge, it's sort of almost like triangular shaped in elevation. It's really worth looking at. But Dallas, they plan to demolish it. This is
Mm,
really very, very iconic complex. It's
hmm,
kind of on that border between modernism and postmodernism.
hmm. All right. Well, I don't see any more audience questions. Do you have any parting words or words of advice for our attendees and just thoughts before we close?
I think, I mean, my advice, I mean, I was already the one about sort of get involved, just really be out there, be advocates for historic preservation, not only in your architecture, in your sort of the sphere of being, let's say, an architect or preservation, but in your community at large.
Mm,
So be a spokesperson for it, in your family, in your community. Um, don't just keep it in your professional life. I think the thing about historic preservation that's so important is there's a sort of texture and a richness to historic neighborhoods, to historic buildings, and that they really create a sense of place that is, there's something about them that adds to like the richness of our life, of our cultural life.
mm,
Um, and I think that's really important. And it's kind of, it helps society kind of be the fabric of society if we have this sort of sense of the shared history of a place.
hmm. Certainly much more interesting than like
Yeah.
scorched
Everything
earth,
being
all
new.
new.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Right. Right.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. And the historic building, I mean, it's not just the like, iconic historic buildings too. It's that fabric of infill buildings as well.
Mhm. Well, Andrew, thank you so much. It was really fun to see you and talk to you,
Yeah.
and we appreciate you
Well,
taking out the
thank you.
time. Yeah. Yeah, and Lisa, do
Yeah.
you want to close us out?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to strongly concur with what Andrew said. If I see another stucco building, it'll be too soon. Um, but I definitely agree about it, preservation being so important to the vitality of our neighborhoods and just the walkability and making it all so much fun. Anyway, huge thank you to Andrew for joining us. It's been such a pleasure seeing you again. I used to have the pleasure of working with Andrew on a day-to-day basis and miss him dearly. So this has been wonderful to catch up. A huge thank you also to Gretchen for your thoughtful moderation for today's program. And to our audience, we're really glad that you joined us today. Really hope that you enjoyed hearing from Andrew. Also, love to hear if you have any suggestions for future guests or professions. Please do let us know. You can put that into the chat. We also have some more great programs on the horizon for you, including part two of our housing law program taking place this Thursday, as well as our special end of year holiday program, which will be starting on Tuesday, December 2nd. You can learn more about these at californiapreservation.org/programs. I'll also drop a link into the chat. While you're there, please consider giving to CPF, especially if you are starting to ponder your end of year giving. Or please go ahead and join. We do offer a 2-year free membership for full-time students. Again, just a huge thank you to Andrew, especially as I believe we're pressing 9 o'clock for you in the evening.
10 o'clock,
Um,
actually, 10
10
o'clock.
o'clock. Well, as we know now, that's when your evening starts.
That's your
Right.
lunchtime.
Um, on behalf of everyone, thank you again to everyone for joining us, and we really hope to see everyone again online soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you,
Thank
Lisa. Thank you,
you.
Gretchen.
Thank
Good to see
you.
you.
Bye.